I had barely taken a sip of my chilled champagne when my phone rang. I remember the weight of the glass in my hand, the ocean breeze brushing against my cheek, and thinking this is what peace is supposed to feel like. Then came the voice that shattered it. It was my son, Eric. There was no joy in his voice. No. Congratulations, Mom, or the house looks amazing. Just instructions. I demand. Really? He told me I needed to move upstairs. That his wife's family, her parents, her siblings, their kids, 11 people in total, were flying in for a 2-week vacation and expected to stay in the master suite. My bedroom. In my home. He'd already promised it to them. And just like that, I was no longer the owner of my dream house. I was being told to vacate my own space to make room for people I didn't even know well. As if my presence in my own home was an inconvenience. I couldn't believe it. I had worked my entire life, 32 years, building a company from scratch. I sold it for $2. $8 million. After taxes. I had enough to finally step away from the pressure. The late nights. The constant responsibility. I bought this beach house not as a trophy, but as a promise to myself that I would live the years I had left on my terms. But that phone call, that was a warning. And what followed? Well, it was nothing short of betrayal. At first, I thought maybe Eric just wasn't thinking, that maybe he was overwhelmed. But the more he spoke, the clearer it became, he wasn't asking. He was telling. And behind his calm tone was an unspoken threat. He said maybe it wasn't safe for someone my age to be living alone in such a large house. And that's when I knew this wasn't about a vacation anymore. This was about control. And I wasn't about to hand mine over. Eric wasn't always like this. I used to believe we were closer than most single moms and their sons. His father left when Eric was just 7. No explanations. No child support. Just silence. I was 35. Juggling 2 jobs and night classes, when I decided I'd never let anyone else determine my stability again. That's how my business started: late nights at the kitchen table. Spreadsheets in one hand. Coffee in the other. I built a small consulting firm from the ground up, starting with local clients and eventually landing contracts with big retail brands. It took years of sacrifice. Missed birthdays. Holidays where it was just the 2 of us and a frozen lasagna because I couldn't afford anything else. But it worked. I made it work. By the time I turned 60, I had a team of 12 and was running operations out of an office in Raleigh. I wasn't flashy. I didn't drive anything new. I poured most of my money back into the business and into Eric. Private school. College. His first apartment. His wedding. His first failed business. Then the second. I didn't complain. I wanted him to have the chances I never did. But somewhere along the line, giving became expected. I didn't realize it at first. It crept in slowly. Calls that started with, "How are you?" turned into, "Can you help me with?" Conversations that used to end in laughter started ending with Venmo requests. And when I sold the company for $2, $8 million, I remember feeling 2 emotions: relief and fear. Not for myself, but because I knew the minute the wire transfer hit, the people around me would change. Or maybe I'd finally see them for who they were. All I wanted was a quiet life near the coast. I picked this beach town because it reminded me of summers Eric and I used to take when he was little, just the 2 of us. Eating fried shrimp and chasing sand crabs at sunset. I thought maybe, if I built something for myself this time, I'd feel whole again. But now, I was starting to wonder, what happens when the people you've given everything to decide they're entitled to take even more? That question wouldn't stay hypothetical for long. The day Eric called, I had been in the house less than 8 hours. The boxes were still half open. The air still smelled of new paint and sea salt. I remember sitting on the porch, watching gulls dip over the waves, feeling for the first time in decades like I could finally breathe. Then his voice cut through that calm. He didn't sound excited or proud. He sounded expectant. Like he was checking off an item on a to-do list. He went straight into logistics. Who was flying in? When they'd arrive. How I should move my things upstairs so they could have the main floor. There wasn't a single pause for how I felt about it. It was as if the house, my house, I was just another asset he'd quietly absorbed into his world. I sat there with the phone to my ear, listening, realizing how far apart we'd grown. Every word he said was a reminder that he didn't see me as a person anymore, just a provider. A resource. A backup plan. He told me it only made sense. Since I lived alone and had so much space, he even hinted that maybe the place was too much for me to handle at my age. That I should be careful living by myself. That one stung the most. It wasn't concern, it was control. Wrapped in polite phrasing. For a moment, I almost gave in. Old habits die hard. Especially when they're built on guilt and love. But something inside me shifted. I had spent my entire life accommodating everyone else's needs. Smoothing over every rough edge. Not this time. That night. I sat on the deck long after the sun disappeared. The phone call still echoing in my mind. The ocean kept moving. Steady and relentless. And I thought, maybe it's time I learned to be that way too. Because deep down, I already knew this wasn't the end of it. It was only the beginning. They showed up at 7:15 in the morning. No warning. No call ahead. Just the sound of tires on gravel and doors slamming shut while I was still in my robe, holding my second cup of coffee. At first, I thought it was a delivery. But then I saw the suitcases. So many suitcases. Eric led the pack. Smiling like nothing was out of the ordinary. His wife, Rachel, trailed behind him, giving instructions like she was managing a hotel check-in. Her parents followed. Then her sister, her brother-in-law, 3 kids, and even their golden retriever, all marching into my home like it had been reserved for them months in advance. They didn't ask where to put their things. They just picked rooms. Someone opened the fridge and made a face. Another started unloading groceries I didn't buy. My things. They were shoved into plastic bags and boxes and pushed aside like clutter. And my bedroom, the master suite with the view of the dunes I'd fallen in love with, was claimed by Rachel's parents. They said it made more sense for them. Something about accessibility and comfort. I didn't argue. Not yet. I just stood there, feeling the space around me shrink. By mid-morning, the place looked like a vacation rental gone wrong. Wet towels draped over chairs. Snack wrappers stuffed between cushions. Kids dripping pool water across hardwood floors I hadn't even finished sealing. No one noticed I hadn't eaten. No one asked if I needed help. I remember standing at the sink around noon, holding a dirty plate someone had left behind, and thinking, how did I become invisible in my own home? I wanted to scream. But I didn't. I smiled, nodded, answered their questions politely. I played along. Because what they didn't know, what Eric didn't know, was that every move they made was sharpening something in me. Something I hadn't felt in years. Not anger. Exactly. Something colder. Clearer. I let them believe they were winning. I let them feel comfortable. Because if they thought I was going to just roll over and give up the one thing I'd built for myself, they didn't know me at all. And soon, they were going to learn exactly who they were dealing with. That night, after the last light had gone out and I could hear nothing but the hum of the refrigerator and the waves brushing the shore, I sat alone in the kitchen with a notebook and a glass of water. Not wine. Not tea. I wanted to stay sharp. I wrote one sentence on the first page. Don't give them what they want. That was the only rule. I wasn't going to shout. I wasn't going to beg for space in my own house. I had played the role of peacekeeper too long. And I'd learned the hard way. Some people mistake grace for weakness. But I also knew better than to go into a storm without a plan. The next morning, while the house buzzed with pancake batter and sunscreen, and the sound of a toddler screaming over a lost toy. I stepped out quietly and drove to town. I went to the attorney who'd handled my closing paperwork. Confirmed what I already knew. My name was the only one on the deed. Then I visited my accountant. Every dime from the sale of my company had been accounted for, taxed, and filed. No shared ownership, no loopholes. And finally, I called a private investigator I'd used once. Years ago, when a vendor tried to steal client data. He was older now, but still sharp. I asked him to do a quiet background pull on Eric. Just facts business. Credit. Assets. Liabilities. Nothing invasive. Just enough to understand what he might be hiding behind that calm, rehearsed tone. I came back home before noon. Nobody noticed I'd been gone. They were too busy planning a barbecue for 30 people that weekend without asking me. As if I were the guest, and they were the owners. So I smiled, and I helped slice the fruit, because they had no idea. But the clock had already started ticking. By Thursday morning, the energy in the house was shifting. They'd grown bolder. No more pretending to be guests. Rachel was dictating what needed to be done. Rearranging furniture. Planning menus. Giving orders like she owned the deed. And Eric, he barely looked at me anymore. When he did, it was with that distant, polite smile. The kind people give to someone they no longer see as important. That's when I found the flyer. It was on the counter, 30 guests invited to a beachside barbecue. My address printed at the bottom in bold letters. I stood there for a long time, holding it in my hand. Feeling that quiet kind of anger that settles deep in your chest, not loud, but solid. That same afternoon, I made a few phone calls. I didn't say much, just that I wanted a private dinner catered for 30. Short notice. High end. Price wasn't a concern. I made sure there'd be champagne. Pâte hors d'oeuvre. Seared scallops. White linens. The whole works. Then I called a local musician I'd met at the farmer's market and asked if he'd play some soft jazz that night by the pool. On Saturday at 6 o'clock. The guests started arriving. I watched them from my kitchen window, some in board shorts. Others already halfway through their second beer. Then the vans rolled in. 2 catering trucks. 1 unmarked delivery van with folding tables and floral centerpieces. The musicians arrived last, setting up near the patio lights. People started whispering. Confused. Curious. That's when I walked out. I wore a black dress. Nothing flashy. Just enough to make it clear this wasn't some backyard hot dog cookout. I greeted people warmly. Thanked them for coming. No one knew what to say. The air felt split. Two versions of the same story were trying to exist at once. Rachel looked like she'd swallowed her tongue. Eric's face tightened. But he didn't say a word. I leaned in and smiled. Told them not to worry. I was just following through on the invite after all. This was their party. Right. As the music picked up and waiters moved through the crowd with trays, I excused myself and slipped upstairs. The ocean breeze drifted through my window while laughter and jazz played below. And for the first time that week, I let myself smile. Because they still thought they were in control. But I had just taken it back. The next morning felt different. The house was quiet. Too quiet. No kids running down the hall. No clatter of pans. No laughter. Just the faint hum of the dishwasher and the smell of leftover champagne. When I walked into the kitchen, Eric and Rachel were sitting at the table, staring at a printed invoice. I didn't have to ask what it was. The bold lettering from the catering company was impossible to miss. $15,000. Prime rib. Lobster tails. Imported champagne. Staff wages. Every cent accounted for. They looked like they'd seen a ghost. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down across from them. The silence between us was thick. Heavy. full of everything that hadn't been said for years. I could feel their panic. They thought I'd put it all on my own card. That somehow this was just another bailout waiting to happen. But they were wrong. The contract had their names on it, listed as event organizers. I made sure of that. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. Watching them realize the weight of their own carelessness was enough. And then came the real blow. Around 11 that morning, my phone rang. It was a real estate agent asking to confirm details about my upcoming property sale. For a moment, I couldn't even speak. Eric had tried to sell my home, my retirement, my sanctuary without my knowledge. That was it. I walked into the living room, where their suitcases were still half open from the week before, and said exactly what needed to be said. Calmly, without yelling, I told them they had 2 hours to gather their things and leave. They didn't argue this time. Maybe they finally understood who they were dealing with. When the last car pulled out of the driveway, I stood on the porch, barefoot, the boards warm beneath my feet. The air smelled like salt and summer and freedom. For the first time in days, the house was mine again. But deep down, I knew this battle wasn't over. It was only changing shape, and the next round would be far more dangerous. I thought the silence would bring peace. But within days of them leaving, it became clear Eric wasn't finished. It started with a letter formal, cold, and wrapped in legal tone. He had hired an attorney. He claimed I was exhibiting signs of cognitive decline, that I had acted erratically, and that my behavior during the so-called dinner stunt proved I was unfit to manage my own finances. He wasn't just lashing out. He was preparing to take control. Then came a call from Adult Protective Services. A welfare check. Someone had reported concerns that I was being manipulated by untrustworthy individuals. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. I remember sitting on the front porch that afternoon, staring out at the sea. Heart pounding, but hands steady. I answered every question calmly, gave them every document they requested, showed them receipts, statements, my deed, everything. They left politely, said they had no concerns. But still, something inside me cracked a little. Not from fear, from grief. How had it come to this? How had the boy I once held through stomach flu and science projects become the man trying to declare me legally incompetent? And worse, how long had he been planning it? I spoke to my attorney the next morning. We went over every contingency power of attorney. Revocable trust. Property title. I wasn't just protecting assets anymore. I was protecting my autonomy. I also called the investigator. I needed to know what Eric's financial situation looked like and why he was pushing so hard now. By the end of the week, pieces of the puzzle started falling into place. He wasn't trying to help me. He was trying to save himself. And I wasn't about to let him bury me to do it. The next part, that's where everything flipped. Because once I saw what he was really hiding, I stopped playing defense, and I took the fight to him. When the investigator's report came in, everything clicked into place. Eric's business was hemorrhaging money. 2 small business loans in default. Credit cards maxed out. And worse, he'd used projected inheritance as leverage on a private loan. That meant someone, somewhere, had agreed to lend him money based on the assumption that I wouldn't be around forever, and that he'd get the house. That broke me in a way I can't fully explain. It wasn't just betrayal, it was premeditated. He hadn't stumbled into desperation. He'd prepared for it, calculated it. And when I refused to hand over my home, he tried to take me out of the equation entirely. I called my lawyer and initiated a full trust transfer. The house was no longer under my name alone. It now belonged to a small holding company, which I controlled. That move sealed every legal crack Eric had been hoping to crawl through. When we met one last time across a polished conference table at a downtown office, he looked tired, cornered. But still, he wore that same calm expression, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even speak for long. I just told him I knew everything. About the loans, the fake sale inquiry, the false reports, and then, as plainly as I could, I told him the truth. I no longer saw him as family. There was no anger left. Only clarity. Some ties aren't worth saving, especially when they've been turned into chains. And just like that, I stood up and walked out. But the end that came later. And it was quieter than you'd expect. I didn't hear from Eric for nearly 3 months. Then, one morning around 10:30, an envelope arrived, no return address. Inside was a letter from his lawyer, apologetic in tone, vague in accountability. He hoped I was well. Said Eric regretted how things unfolded. That maybe, in time, I'd be open to reconnecting. I folded the letter once and placed it in a drawer. Not out of spite, but because sometimes, silence is the only answer that honors the truth. By then, the house had already changed. I'd converted it into a high-end vacation rental. Managed through a private company. Cleaners came weekly. The landscaping was handled professionally. Guests arrived. Paid respectfully. Left glowing reviews. The space that once held tension and resentment now welcomed gratitude and quiet joy. And me, I found something better than peace. I found freedom. Not just from Eric, but from the version of myself who thought love had to mean sacrifice. That being a good mother meant erasing my own needs. That family loyalty was unconditional. Even when it hurt. What I've learned is this: boundaries aren't walls. They're doors. And sometimes, the kindest thing you can do is close one behind you and walk forward. Without looking back. If you're listening to this and it feels familiar, if you've ever been made to feel small in a space you built, please know you're not alone. And you're not wrong for choosing yourself. And if this story meant something to you, I'd love for you to share it. Or leave a comment. Maybe you've lived something similar. Maybe you're living it now. Either way, thank you for hearing mine.